there, welcome to part 2 of this tutorial series. Today we'll be taking the general landmass that we created in part 1 and creating this. You can see we've got the rivers added, lakes, nice erosion, and obviously the kind of coloured and textures done. This is quite a complicated workflow, so in order to just help me and not get lost making this tutorial, I've kind of made this ahead of time, but don't worry, I'm going to go through every single node and explain the adjustments that you need to make. Drop me a comment if you get lost anywhere and I'm happy to reach out and help. So going back to where we left off, I did make slightest modification. I just kind of clamped this adjust node down slightly just to kind of reduce the size of the cliffs around the edges, just make it a little less dramatic than where we left off. But overall, I'm pretty happy with this as a starting point. So the first node in the process is fractal terraces. And just as a reminder, as for each of these nodes, you just need to drag from the out at the previous step and then just type the name. Alternatively, you could kind of look through the menus here to find and explore. So fractal terraces, this is, I'd say, an optional step. See what works for your map. But you can see the difference here. It just sort of creates these layers in the rock. And I think this gives a nice look and gives the erosion step something a bit more interesting to work with rather than just the plain slopes. Play around with the spacing. I've got it at 0.08 right now, but you can see that it can have quite a bit of an effect on the overall terrain. So, just make sure that it's not having any kind of unintended consequences, like just completely destroying a bit of your coast or something like that. So I'm going to keep the fractal terraces in. And then next we're going to use an Erosion 2 node. So the Erosion 2 node is an updated algorithm for Gaea2. It's much faster and allows you to have a good amount of control over how much the erosion changes the shape that you use as the input. So some key settings that you'll want to play around with are the duration, the erosion scale, and the shape. So if I just change this erosion scale for a bit now and make this quite large, this is essentially kind of replicating if we were working on a much smaller scale, and therefore the erosion is then much more dramatic. It's really taking a lot away from your input geometry. So we definitely want to go with kind of smaller numbers if we're working on something that's meant to be a large size. And it's at this point, I remember I'm still in 4K, so I'm just going to drop this resolution. We'll go for 2K. We'll lose some of the details. It is good to go back and check in 4K, especially at the erosion step before you move on, but I'll drop it down to 2K for now. So yeah, erosion scale, that makes a fair bit of difference. Also the shape. So if we change this to a large value, this is basically telling Gaea2 that it can have quite a lot of freedom with how it's eroding the shape. You can see around the edges where we had those cliffs, they're now not so steep, but you lose quite a bit of the detail that you had in that input map that we generated from Wonderdraft, or if you've used Photoshop with your 2D map. So for this kind of workflow, we don't want to give Gaea that freedom. So I'm just going to turn the shape back down so we can keep it closer to what we had before. So erosion does two things. two main things in my mind. One, it's the kind of the down cutting, so removing mass from sort of sloped areas as the water moves over the surface. But then it also transports that sediment and then starts to kind of fill the kind of lower areas where the water is being washed to. So I've left this as the default values, but feel free to play around with these to kind of change how the sedimentation happens. But for this, I'm pretty happy with this this erosion for now. The next step is the rivers node. So again, drag out, type rivers. And yeah, this is just going to simulate where the rivers would form given this terrain. You can play around with the amount of water, how deep the rivers will go and how much they cut down into the land. By default, this river valley width is set to 0. But one thing that this does is kind of, you can sort of see it here. You can see it's kind of like bulking out, presumably where some, sediment is being transported. I think that's a cool feature for other maps, but again, at the scale that we're working at, this then makes it a bit more difficult to define the coast. And this sort of areas, now it's a bit more elevated, won't be filling up with water. So I turn that right down to -4. And just wait for that to update. Here we go. But yeah, and as you can, there's a nice example here. It's not just simulating the water running across the surface. It is actually impacting the surface itself. So it's cutting, over the large time scales that this is simulating. It's kind of cutting down into the rock of the surface and updating the terrain, which is pretty cool and also useful for when it comes to 3D printing. You can then also see these rivers forming. Okay. You can see here we've got lots of things coming out of the river node. Don't worry about that for now. I'm going to just go through the things that are affecting the 3D of the terrain for now. So the next step is the lake step. I've used a lake step, lake node to include the ocean as well. Like I've not added a sea node here. The lake is doing a good enough job. The nice thing about the lake is that it's obviously forming these inland lakes as well, where there's kind of areas of water where it's pooled. You can see here that we can no longer see the kind of rivers being rendered. Don't worry, we'll get all those back later. Interestingly, if you do the lake node before the rivers node, you end up with an awful lot more lakes. I guess, obviously, without the rivers, there's nowhere for the water to go, and so they really pool everywhere. So yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting how you need to kind of get the right workflow. This workflow makes sense to me to have the rivers first, but yeah, interested to hear if anyone thinks otherwise. The important thing about the lakes is, rather than when we had the sea node, we could just define what the sea level was. We don't have that now. We have a precipitation slider. I think the key thing here is to just increase and decrease this so until you get the desired effect. So typically what you want to see is areas of water that you want to see filled. You want to make sure they're filled. So for example, this little bit here, it's perhaps not what we want. So I can turn this up a little bit. And there we go. We can see now that that's nicely filled in. And we still have a sort of reasonable number of lakes here. And, eventually, if you go up too high, the water then just spills over and your mountains become islands, which may be cool, but again, not what we're going for here. The next and final step as part of the 3D workflow is the addition of the trees node. So by default, the count is very low for this kind of amount of land. I put it all the way to the top, and also the trees are very large, so I put it down as small as I can take them. So they're still probably a bit too large to be realistic, but everything's a bit overemphasized on this terrain. It just makes it a bit more visually appealing. Now, by default, if I remove this connection here, what you'll see is the trees are growing everywhere. And that's because right now it has no idea of knowing what's land and what's water. So we don't want the trees to be obviously growing in the sea, on the lakes, or in the rivers. So to do that, we need to use this inhibition port here. So the next step is to drag from the depth output of the lakes to the depth output of the rivers. This gives us something where you really can't see that much. So we need to use a effects node, so an adjust node, drag out type FX. And then we want to turn on drop, auto level, equalize, and strong. And then this is now creating our inhibition mask. So anywhere that's white, we're going to inhibit the growth of the trees. And then when I add that back into the trees, you can see now that we've got, the growth of the trees is restricted to the land. And we can change, perhaps by default, the trees are growing on slopes that you deem too steep. We can adjust the slope. Perhaps you want to change the kind of maximum altitude that you find the trees. I find turning on aggressive mode in the growth gives kind of more interesting results. And yeah, just play around with the patches and chaos until you get a result that you like. So if your intention is to just create a 3D printable version of your map, then at this stage, you're done. We can, in terms of Gaea anyway, we're now ready to export the height map into Blender. So this is everything we're going to be doing with the 3D side of things. So you would export, right click, mark for export, and then go into project and build. But we're not going to do that right now. We're going to take a look at the texturing. And this bit does look complicated, but we will go through this step by step together. So I'm going to start off with texturing the land. So to do this, I'm going to go back to the rivers node, because this is kind of the most advanced node that is representing just the overall shape of the land. So the first step is to drag out from the rivers node and create a texture base node. So if I click on this, you can see what this is doing is looking at all the different shape variations, the slope, having an idea of perhaps where soil accumulates, where we have like the more rocky regions. And this kind of just helps provide some information for the textures. I've also, by dragging out from rivers, created a slope node. So this is what we're going to use as a mask to differentiate between the steep rocky parts and then the flat parts that I want a kind of more like grassy look. This has a bit more of a subtle effect, but we can also drag out and create a flow node. And you can see here, this is where obviously all the rainwater would track and collect. And this can be useful for just adding in another color on top of your grass node, perhaps to kind of represent perhaps some more like soil or something like that that's being kind of washed down by the rain. I have clicked auto level for the flow node, just without it. It's just a little bit too subtle, and we want it to be a bit stronger. So starting off with the texture base. So I've used 2 satellite maps, or saturation maps. I've heard both. I feel like this is a GIF kind of situation, but yeah, I should ask the makers of Gaea what the right answer is. So this essentially takes that texture input and allows you to select a color palette to apply to it. So I've picked color 323 here. I wanted something quite dark for my rocks. It's often quite good to look at reference photos for perhaps the type of biome you're trying to create. Maybe you're creating kind of like a desert landscape or something like that, and a different set of colors would make more sense for you. But yeah, and these are kind of grouped together by rock, sand, green, blue, and then color for some more interesting landscapes. Kind of perhaps you've got like lava fields or something like that. But for now, I'm going to just stick with 323. This is a real kind of, as with any creative process, you sort of need to just look around and explore and experiment and see what works for you. For the kind of, less slopey, rocky areas, I want to have a kind of a green map. So I've gone for something fairly vibrant here. One thing that's worth noting is when you see kind of smooth gradients like this one, you kind of end up with like much less of that detail being shown through. If you see something here where there's lots of discrete lines, you can see then you really get the sort of texture differences coming through. I think this one provides like a nice balance between the two, so 252 and the green section. So we've got our 2 types of color. The next is to combine them. So we drag out from the top node into the bottom node, and this will generate a combine node. We need to set this to blend and then the ratio up to 1. I'll just remove this at first. So by changing the ratio up to 1, it just shows you all of one. And you can go to the other one, it will just show you all of the other one. But what we're going to do is add a mask from this slope. So we're going to say, we want to see the green texture more where there's the white, and the darker texture more where there's the black. You may need to, sometimes you'll see that the colors are the wrong way around. Just go back to your mask and click the invert. Let's have a quick look, see. So yeah, for this example, if you see this, don't worry, you just need to go back to the mask and click the invert button. Okay, so this has given us kind of a nice starting point, differentiating the sort of the rocky slopes from the flatter areas. I now want to kind of combine another texture from this flow map. So in this case, I've actually just dragged directly from the flow map into another sat map. And here I went into the sand section and picked this one, quite like a brown color. You can sort of see where the brown is collating in these lower areas that are being affected by the flow. And again, it's just to combine these, drag out from the previous step into this, and we get this. Again, taking the output from the flow map to use as the mask. This one's quite a subtle effect. You could just see as I go back and forth between the two of them, it really just kind of darkens some of these areas. But I do find when you add up all of these subtle effects, then it really can make quite a difference to the visuals. If it's too subtle for you, perhaps what we need to do is turn on the shaper node again, and we can just move this so that the kind of white areas are a bit brighter. And then as we go back to this section, you can now see these kind of flow trails a bit more pronounced now. Yeah, I think that looks pretty cool. Okay, so we have done the kind of main land. The next thing that I want to look at is the kind of coastal areas, so around the coast of the whole island, and then where we have the lakes, just kind of like the lake edge. I want to have something kind of a little bit sandy. So for this, I've just dragged out of the shore and then created a sat map. I've gone into sand. I've just picked this one, 313. It's not too saturated. It's perhaps a little bit grey, but yeah, I think this would look quite nice for sort of the around the coast. So it's the same workflow. We want to drag out from the sat map into the step before. And remembering always blend, set the ratio to 1. And here we need to create another mask. So in this case, I've just dragged out from shore to another adjust node. And here I've just auto leveled and inverted it so that the land is white. And when we combine the two, we get something that looks like this. So you can sort of see that this is obviously filling in the water as well for now. But don't worry, we're going to get to that in the next step. But before we add the water in, this is another new node for Gaea2 that I really like. Is this color erosion node. So again, this is now kind of simulating, after long time periods, millions of years of rainfall on a terrain, kind of simulating how this would transport the color slightly. Perhaps this does sort of some similar effects to what we did with the flow map, but this looks quite cool. Change these settings as you like. I've just left them with the default now. Again, it's quite a sort of subtle effect with the settings that I've used. So we can see before and after. You might find that this has actually removed some of the details you like. So perhaps my flow details have sort of been removed, but also, there's kind of like quite a harsh edge here that's been kind of like smoothed out. You can see that the color kind of leaks into the ocean a bit, but that's fine. We're going to cover that up in a second. So now that we've got the kind of the land taken care of, I'm just going to take a look at the sea. Now, obviously, we're going to be looking at the rivers and the sea at the same time here. Now, in order to give, it's absolutely fine if you want to skip this step and just have a single blue color for your sea. But I think it's a bit of a shame to kind of miss out on the nice color variations that you can get from the different depths of the ocean around your landmass. And if we had, say, used the output from Wonderdraft directly and just added the water level and not done any erosion on it to change the mask, to change the land mass, we could have taken that depth information from the sea and to use that to affect the color. But we've taken a slightly different workflow and we've lost that information. But we're going to try and bring it back here. So zooming out, what I've done is taken just the original file input and dragged it across and combined it with a ridge node. Now, the reason for combining it with the ridge node is we still have quite a lot of sort of flat areas, and I just want to create something a bit more interesting under the sea. So here I'm actually going to blend the two. So the nice thing about this is this original file input that we then added C to kind of cut some of the lower areas out of view. This kind of provides a nice bit of elevation around the landmass. And this can basically represent the shallower waters. And by blending it with a ridge node, this kind of creates this sort of look of a seabed around the rest of the sea. So this just needs to be fed into a sat map. It's obviously displaying the geometry of the sort of upstream nodes at the moment. If you do want to check out your actual geometry at any point, just go to the trees and click users underlay. And then when we go back here, you can see now we're kind of showing this on our final output geometry. But you can see here the kind of color variations around the coast, sort of indicating these lower depth areas, and then the ridge node creating kind of interest where it was previously entirely flat. I guess the one important thing to note as well, so yeah, in terms of the color that I've used, I've gone for 53 in the blue section. You really, I guess it kind of makes sense to have it so that the darker blues represent the deeper areas. If you find something you like and it's the wrong way around, then you can always just hit this reverse button. But yeah, I quite like how this looks. The other source of water comes from the rivers. So in order to bring the rivers into play as well, I've just taken the depth out of the rivers node. I've adjusted it. So with an adjust node, I've just turned auto level on by default, the values, because obviously the depth isn't that much at any point on the rivers relative to the sort of 0 to 1 scale that Gaea uses. We can use the auto level node to just make these more apparent. we can feed this directly into a sat map. And again, just pick something that gives you the right kind of blue. Generally, obviously we don't need to worry that all of this terrain is blue because we're going to mask it off. And so, so the next step is to then start combining our water color information with our ground information. So we'll do the rivers first because we don't want to see the rivers in the sea. So we just need to drag from the out of this color erosion node to the out of the sat map to create a combine mode, combine node. Again, set the ratio to 1 and set it to blend. And then we're going to need to create a mask. So drag from this adjust node into a second adjust node. And this second adjust node, we're just going to make a slight change by increasing the shaper slightly. This is just to make some of the rivers a bit brighter. If you click the combine node and set lock preview, we can then make adjustments here. And this is really just to show, increase or decrease the effect that kind of river overlay is having. If we make this quite extreme, you can see that they're really very obvious, and maybe this is something that you want, but my feeling is, having something just a tad more subtle looks a bit nicer. Okay, I'm just gonna unlock that preview. So now we've got the blue of the rivers running over the land. We want to introduce the lakes or the sea. So I'm going to do this in 2 separate steps actually. And we're going to do it once for just the sea, and then we're going to add the lakes separately. Same workflow. So we would drag from our latest node, which was the one with the rivers, into the output of the sat map we created for the sea. And this time I'm just going to use the height to mask off where the sea is. So we can drag out from the rivers, create a height mask, and again, we've got this now nicely separated off between the land and the water. And then once we have this set to blend and the ratio of 1, we now have our nice sea with its color variation, and then our beaches sort of around the coastline. Moving slightly, it's difficult to keep this nicely organized. I think that's a skill in itself that I perhaps lack. But add now the color for the lakes. Similar process, we're going to drag out from the depth into an effects node, and then into a sat map. Again, we can use this, I think I've actually left this as default settings, but we can use this to, again, shape the color variations. And you can see here, this is actually fairly flat. I think this is pretty reasonable. It sort of shows our kind of like where we've got more depth in the lakes and the more shallow ones. But then the next step is, of course, as before, combining, so dragging, I think this time we're going out from here into the sat map for the lakes. You know the drill now, blend, ratio of 1. And then for the mask, you may notice a bit of a jump cut at this point because I realized my mask was incorrect and I've had to update it. It's a little bit more complicated now, but it's okay. We can work through it. So we go out from the depth to create this kind of lake mask. So this is with a drag out, another adjust node, and switch on auto level, equalize, and strong. But you can see that this also includes all of the C as well. And we don't really want to be kind of overwriting the work that we did creating that nice ocean earlier. So in order to do that, we need an additional height mask to combine with it. So this height mask, I'm going to take from the output of the rivers node, because the output of the lake node would include the surface of the water, and we want to kind of remove that. So by dragging out from the rivers, we can have this height mask. And here, obviously, now we can see we just have the land selected in white. And then we just drag out from the height mask into our lake mask to create a new mask. And we do this by multiplying the two masks together. So the black values have a value of 0, and multiplying all the way up to a ratio of 1 then gives us something that is actually just selecting the lakes that are on the land. And then we can drag this into the mask port to give us these lakes that have been correctly selected. Okay, so we've got the land, we've got the water. The next step is to do the trees, and then we're almost there. So from the trees, we want to take the there may be a better workflow than this, but this seems to be what works for me. Drag out from the trees output into another texture base, and then from here into a sat map. And of course, we want something green. I've gone for 97 in the green section, just something quite vibrant. Obviously, all this looks a lot, but it's fine because we're going to be overlaying it in a second. For the mask, we take the trees output, and again, we want to turn on auto level, equalize strong, and invert. Dragging out from the tree sat map into our latest kind of combined texture. Then from our mask into the combine node, set to blend, ratio of 1, and then we have our final textured landscape. One additional thing that I like to do at this step. So first of all, we're going to mark this for export. So right click and then mark for export. And another thing that I quite like to do when we're in Blender, and I'll show this in the next video, is to make the water reflective. So a convenient way of doing that is to go back here to our water mask, which we used before to inhibit the tree growth. And I'll use this as a texture to influence the roughness of the principal shader in Blender, making it so that we've got nice reflective water, but still with rough land. So again, on this water mask, this effects node, right click, mark for export. And I do recommend actually right clicking and renaming this. Obviously by default this just says adjust. Rename it to water mask so that the final file output will have the same name. So the three things that we want to have marked for export is, as I say, the water mask. The trees is because as this has our kind of final 3D terrain output. And then this combine node, which I will rename to texture. And yeah, now we're ready to run the export. I'll just kind of update this to 4K. I'll let this load. I'll be back in a second. Okay, now that's done updating to 4K, we can now really appreciate the this beautiful landscape. I do believe in the free edition of Gaea, you can visualize your output in 4K. You just can't export at 4K, unfortunately. You're limited to 1K. But yeah, I think this is looking pretty nice and is ready to go into Blender. I really like this approach for starting to build your kind of homebrew world, you know, starting with the terrain and the landmass, and then thinking afterwards, you know, what the civilization would be doing here, what the plot hooks that the terrain provides. Do we have, I don't know, a smuggler's cove down here, and you know, what kind of encounter could you have crossing this tiny little rocky precipice into this island, and what mysteries would be there. I think it makes sense to start with the land first, and then add the civilization and the stories after, because the land was there first. So I will give these a render. I guess let's cover actually the build settings. So you want to select the resolution that's available to you. So in the free edition, it will be limited to 1K. And in the premium versions, you can have very high resolutions. 4K gives a nice enough output for a single tile. We can also do tiled builds. So let's say I do 16K, and I'm going to make each individual tile a 4K. So now this level of detail we're seeing for this entire square would be applied to each of the 4 squares. And this is kind of my preferred approach for 3D printing at a larger scale. I have a resin printer, so I can't really get much. I can't get a large size, but yeah, you can then print at much larger scales. Next thing to look at is the node section. You can change the file output here, so it might make more sense for the texture to render it as a PNG file, but I would leave these as EXRs. Yeah, and when you're happy, you just hit build, and we'll be ready to go into Blender. So I hope I will have that tutorial prepared soon. There we'll cover creating nice renders, and then also the workflow for turning this into a 3D printable STL file. Hit like if this has been useful, and yeah, subscribe for updates and future videos.